Imagine a situation where the world around you disappears in a white haze and the wind howls so loudly that it drowns out all thought. In the middle of the Great Plains, a winter storm can last for several days, turning any dwelling into an island cut off from the rest of the world by a wall of ice. In such conditions, attempting to go outside is tantamount to suicide, and lighting a fire inside becomes an impossible task due to the lack of dry wood or draft. But it is at this moment, when the cold creeps under the blankets, that the true test of human spirit and foresight begins. The Indians of the Great Plains honed the art of survival in the icy hell for centuries, and their main weapons were not bows and arrows, but special knowledge about food. They understood that when an external source of heat is unavailable, the only way to keep warm is with an internal fire, which is ignited by the right food. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how a handful of dry mix could replace a hot meal and save the lives of an entire tribe in complete darkness. What if I told you that everything you believed about the need for hot food in the cold is not entirely true? When the temperature drops well below zero, the human body begins to work in extreme mode, requiring a tremendous amount of energy just to keep the heart beating. At such times, the hot meat or soup we are accustomed to provides only a short-term effect, deceiving the body with a false sense of warmth. Native Americans understood this physiology perfectly on an intuitive level, passed down through generations of surviving ancestors. They knew that to withstand the cold for a long time, they needed fuel that would burn slowly and hotly inside, like charcoal. In conditions where the hearth had gone out and there was no way to rekindle it, food that did not require heat treatment came to the fore. This was food prepared long before the first snow, on warm days of successful hunting and harvesting. The whole point of this strategy was to make people completely independent of external environmental conditions. You don't need firewood, you don't need a pot, and you don't need water, which still needs to be melted in winter. You just take a piece of the finished product from your supplies and begin the process of survival. The main secret was the understanding that fat is the most concentrated source of energy available to humans in the wild. Pure meat, devoid of fat, in severe frost could lead to so-called rabbit starvation, when the body expends more energy on digestion than it receives in return. Therefore, the winter diet was always built around fat reserves, which were valued much higher than the best cuts of meat. It was a real energy bomb, capable of kick-starting the metabolism of a freezing person in a matter of minutes. Fat enveloped the stomach and gave a long, steady feeling of fullness that allowed one to survive the longest and darkest night. Preparation for such situations began many months in advance, when the buffalo were particularly well-fed and full of strength. Hunters and gatherers carefully selected certain parts of the carcass that contained the hardest and highest quality internal fat. This product did not spoil for months and did not require special storage conditions, except for dryness and coolness. It was melted, cleaned of impurities, and turned into a universal basis for the future winter diet. It was hard and painstaking work, on the quality of which the future of the entire camp depended. Surprisingly, the culture of the Plains peoples had a clear division between summer food and survival food. Summer food could be light, varied, and fresh, bringing joy and satisfaction in the here and now. Winter food, intended for blizzards, was perceived as a strategic resource, as a cure for death. Its taste was specific, very rich and heavy, which was necessary for extreme conditions. No one ate these supplies just for the sake of pleasure, while it was possible to obtain fresh meat. When a storm covered the camp, people switched to energy-saving mode, trying to move less and stay warm under their skins. In the darkness of the tipi, amid the roar of the wind, the distribution of food became a silent and important ritual. Each portion was measured out with precision because no one knew how many days the snow captivity would last. Food that could be eaten dry became the only connection to life in this icy silence. It did not require unnecessary movement, did not create a smell that could attract predators, and did not take up precious time. This approach is radically different from how we are used to perceiving comfort food in the cold season. We look for hot tea or soup to warm our hands and throat, getting instant relief. For the inhabitants of the plains, warmth was an internal process, the result of a complex chemical reaction of fat breakdown. They relied on their bodies as if they were perfect stoves that just needed to be fed the right fuel. And these stoves worked flawlessly, allowing people to survive where it seemed there was no place for life. There was no room for chance or last-minute luck in this strategy. If you didn't prepare the right food in the summer, you were doomed to die of cold and exhaustion in the winter. Nature did not forgive carelessness, and every storm was a harsh examiner, testing the homework done months ago. Only those who took the preparation of provisions as seriously as the manufacture of weapons survived. This lesson in discipline and foresight, engraved at the genetic level, shaped the unique character of the inhabitants of the plains. They looked at the horizon not with fear, but with readiness, knowing that their bags contained the compressed energy of the sun and the grasses of the steppe. They could go weeks without seeing an open fire, yet still retain their strength, clarity of mind, and ability to act. It was a victory of human reason over the blind fury of the elements. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this philosophy of nutrition, where food is pure fuel rather than pleasure? Write about it in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about survival. Are you ready to learn the truth about a product that can be stored for 50 years without refrigeration? Pemmican is rightly considered the pinnacle of food engineering by the indigenous peoples of North America and the ideal storm ration. It is not just dried meat, but a complex concentrate in which each ingredient performs its own vital function. The basis of pemmican was bison, moose, or deer meat, cut into thin strips and dried in the sun or over smoke until completely hard. Moisture was the main enemy of long-term storage, so the meat was dried to such an extent that it crumbled into dust when struck. The process of making pemmican was laborious and required the participation of many people, turning it into a real production. The dried meat was placed on skins and methodically crushed with stone hammers to a fibrous flour. This meat dust was extremely rich in protein, but on its own it could not provide energy for a freezing person. To turn protein into fuel, a second essential component was needed: melted fat. It was fat that became the binding element that preserved the meat and gave it its enormous calorie content. The mixing ratio was strict and had been refined over centuries. Approximately 1 part meat powder to 1 part fat by weight. The fat, usually kidney fat, was melted over low heat, making sure that it did not burn and acquire a bitter taste. The hot liquid was poured into the meat flour, thoroughly mixing the mass until it became homogeneous, similar to thick dough. While the mixture was still hot, it was tightly packed into leather bags, squeezing out all the air to prevent oxidation. The result was a product of incredible density and nutritional value, surpassing many modern army rations. A small piece of pemmican, about the size of a palm, could replace a full meal for an adult man engaged in heavy physical labor. In a blizzard, when the body did not expend energy on movement, the need for food decreased and the supplies lasted for a long time. Pemmican did not freeze solid even in the most severe frost due to its high fat content. It could be bitten off or cut with a knife at any time without wasting energy on defrosting. Pemmican had a specific taste, but in conditions of hunger and cold, it seemed like the most desirable food. The neutral, slightly salty taste of meat was mixed with the rich oiliness of fat, creating a feeling of instant satiety. Sometimes dried berries were added to the mixture to add sourness and enrich the diet with vitamins, but the basic recipe remained unchanged. This product did not cause thirst, which was critically important when water was only available in the form of snow. Pemmican was so important to the economy of the plains that it later became the subject of active trade with European fur buyers. It allowed travelers to cover vast distances without having to spend time hunting and cooking. But for the Indians themselves, it was primarily a strategic reserve in case of war or natural disaster. Bags of pemmican were stored in the most protected places in the dwelling, always ready for use. In a snowstorm, when it was impossible to go outside, pemmican became the center of the universe for people locked in their homes. It gave them not only physical strength, but also psychological confidence that tomorrow would come. Not having to cook food allowed them to stay calm and quiet, saving oxygen and heat inside the shelter. It was the perfect food for waiting, when the only task was to endure the fury of nature. History knows of cases when entire detachments survived in snowdrifts for weeks, carrying only bags of this nutritious mixture. Pemmican did not spoil, mold, or lose its properties for years if the bag remained sealed. It was found in old hiding places decades later and was still edible. It was a real-time capsule, storing the energy of the summer sun and the power of wild animals. It is difficult to compare pemmican with modern products, as there is nothing in our diet that is as concentrated and natural. It was an absolute triumph of functionality over form, pure survival packed in rawhide. It teaches us that very little is needed to live, if that little is done with intelligence and knowledge. Pemmican was the foundation of the plains civilization, allowing people to thrive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Pemmican was the king of the winter diet, but it was not the only salvation from hunger. Did you know that another source of life, often forgotten by historians, could be found under the snow? What I am about to show you has long gone unnoticed by researchers focused solely on hunting. Hidden in the shadow of majestic bison and hunting scenes was the quiet but vital role of plant foods in winter survival. When blizzards howled outside and meat supplies needed to be conserved, timsala, or prairie turnip, came to the rescue. This unassuming root vegetable was a real lifesaver, a source of carbohydrates that provided quick energy to the brain and muscles. Unlike meat, which takes a long time to digest, the dried root provided strength almost instantly. Timsala was harvested in early summer, when the steppe was in bloom, and the plant was easy to locate by its distinctive leaves. Women dug up the roots with special sticks, trying not to damage the valuable flesh hidden deep in the hard ground. This was not just gathering food, but laying the foundation for security during the long winter months. The roots were cleaned of their rough skin and braided into long plaits, similar to how hair is braided. These garlands were hung out in the sun, where they dried to the consistency of hard wood. When dried, prairie turnips could be stored indefinitely without losing their nutritional properties or rotting. They became light, almost weightless, which was critical to the nomadic lifestyle of the tribes. During travel, these bundles did not take up much space and did not weigh down horses or dogs. But when trouble came and it was impossible to build a fire, the dry turnip revealed its potential. It could be chewed dry, slowly softening in the mouth and turning into a nutritious porridge. The taste of dried timsala was sweet, reminiscent of a mixture of nuts and flour, which added a pleasant variety to the fatty meat diet. In stressful and cold conditions, this sweet taste served as an excellent antidepressant, reminding them of warmer days. In addition, chewing on the hard root helped pass the time and distract them from the howling wind outside the thin walls of their dwelling. It was a kind of meditative process that allowed them to focus on a simple action. It is important to note that timsala contains starch, which provided the body with glucose, necessary for the brain to function in extreme conditions. A purely meat diet could lead to lethargy and clouded consciousness, while the root restored clarity of thought. The Indians intuitively sensed this balance, trying to combine fatty foods with plant-based foods even in the most difficult situations. It was a primitive but effective diet based on the observations and experience of generations. Sometimes, if there was even the slightest opportunity to obtain warm water, pieces of the root were thrown into it, where they swelled and became soft. But in the midst of a blizzard, when all liquids froze, the dry method of eating was the only possible and quite acceptable one. The structure of the root was such that it did not crumble into sharp fragments, but separated into fibers. This made it safe to eat even in complete darkness, by touch. In addition to timsala, other roots were also harvested, such as vagabond root or wild onion. But turnip was the queen of the reserves. It was valued for its saturity and reliability. It never failed and was available across vast areas of the plains. Hiding places with these roots were often made separately from meat, so that if one type of supply was spoiled, the other would be preserved. Such diversification of risks was a sign of wise planning. For many tribes, this root was not just food, but a sacred gift of the earth, a symbol of connection with the underground world that feeds people in winter. Having it in your bag gave you a sense of security comparable to having a full quiver of arrows. It was a quiet, unnoticeable force that sustained life when the sun turned away from people. In modern culture, we have almost lost our knowledge of such wild plants, relying on store-bought vegetables. But the story of timsala reminds us that nature provides humans with everything they need to survive. if they know where to look. This humble route has saved no fewer lives than the famous bison and deserves its place in history. If you enjoy learning about these hidden details of history, be sure to like this video. It will help us find even more unique facts for you. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of desserts from the past? Among the harsh survival diet, there was a dish that could be called the energy bar of the 19th century, known to the Lakota as Vasna. It was an improved version of Pemmican, to which one key ingredient was added that changed everything: dried service berries. The berries not only improved the taste, but also added essential acids and micronutrients to the heavy-fat diet. Vasna was considered a sacred food used in ceremonies, but in times of terrible blizzards, it became a life-saving treat. The process of making Vasna was particularly meticulous, as bird cherry berries have large pits. The Indians did not remove them, but ground the berries whole, together with the pits, into a homogeneous paste. When crushed, the pits released substances that gave the mixture a light almond aroma and served as an additional preservative. This berry paste was dried and then mixed with minced meat and fat, creating a product with a unique flavor profile. In the blizzard, when the body suffered from monotony and sensory deprivation, the bright taste of bird cherry was a real shock to the taste buds. The acidity of the berries helped break down heavy fats, facilitating digestion and preventing nausea from overeating lard. It was the perfect combination of protein, fat, and carbohydrates in one compact lump. Vaspu could be slowly sucked on, enjoying every nuance of flavor, which helped combat the psychological pressure of confined spaces. The Indians knew that bird cherry also had medicinal properties, supporting immunity in cold and stressful conditions. Although they did not know the word vitamins, they saw that those who ate berries were less likely to get sick and remain cheerful. Therefore, berry cakes were saved for children. Although we do not mention them on camera, we imply caring for the weak and the elderly, as well as for the most difficult days of bad weather. It was a resource that was used with particular care. Vasna did not crumble as much as regular pemmican, thanks to the stickiness of the berry juice, which made it convenient to eat in the dark. It did not stain the hands as much as pure fat and left a pleasant aftertaste. In a world where smells were limited to smoke, sweat, and wet fur, the aroma of bird cherry reminded them of summer and blossoms. This emotional component of food was no less important than its caloric content. Berry harvesting was a mass event. Entire groves of bird cherry trees were stripped bare in a matter of days. The berries were dried on skins under the scorching sun until they turned into hard, shriveled peas. In this form, they could wait for years to become part of a life-saving mixture. This was an example of how the gifts of a short season of abundance were preserved for a long season of need. In addition to bird cherry, other berries were also used: urga, buffalo berry, shepherdaya, but it was bird cherry that was considered the classic ingredient. Its astringent taste perfectly balanced the blandness of meat and the cloying sweetness of fat. It was a gastronomic harmony born out of the need to survive. Vasna was proof that even in extreme conditions, people strive to make their food not only healthy, but also delicious. This product was also often taken by warriors on long campaigns, knowing that it would give them strength for a rush or battle. But in the context of a winter storm, Vasna became a quiet celebration of life amid the howling chaos. It gave hope that the cold would not last forever and that the earth would bear fruit again. The food was ready, but how could it be kept fresh in conditions of constant dampness and temperature fluctuations? In the next chapter, you will learn how Native Americans created the perfect container that worked better than modern plastic. In a world without plastic containers and vacuum packaging, preserving food was an art no less important than obtaining it. The Native Americans of the Great Plains invented a unique storage system that was ideal for their nomadic lifestyle and harsh climate: the parfleche. These were hard envelopes made of rawhide that provided reliable protection for pemmican, dried meat, and other valuable supplies. The name parfleche came from French trappers and meant arrow reflecting, which spoke to the incredible strength of the material. The manufacture of parfleche began with the processing of bison hides, which were cleaned of wool and fat and then stretched to the limit. Unlike soft suede for clothing, the leather for parfleche had to remain stiff and retain its shape. The wet hide was folded into an envelope or suitcase shape, giving it the desired size and geometry while it dried. Once hardened, it became similar to hard cardboard or plastic, impervious to moisture and rodents. These leather chests were not just containers, they were part of a system for survival during blizzards. The thick leather did not allow odors to escape, which was critical in order not to attract predators to the camp during times of hunger. In addition, the airtight packaging protected food from dampness and condensation, which inevitably formed in the dwelling when people breathed. Mold was a deadly enemy of supplies, and parfleche held the line reliably. Parfleche bags were always decorated with geometric patterns, which were applied using natural dyes and served not only as decoration, but also as markings. Each family had its own style of painting, and the pattern made it easy to determine what was inside and who it belonged to. In the dim light of the teepee, the bright colors on the leather helped people find their way around and quickly locate the right bag of provisions. It was a kind of inventory that every member of the community understood without words. Inside the dwelling, the parfleche bags were laid along the walls, creating an additional layer of insulation from the cold ground and wind penetrating under the canopy. Thus, food not only fed people, but also literally protected them from the cold with its volume. In a blizzard, these leather briquettes became a wall between fragile human life and icy death outside. It was an ingenious use of the limited space in the teepee. The parfleche flaps were tied with leather straps so cleverly and tightly that it was impossible to open them accidentally. This ensured that the contents would not spill out during transport or in the turmoil of an emergency evacuation. The reliability of the packaging gave confidence that, no matter what happened, the food would remain safe. Even if the dwelling was destroyed by the wind, the parfleches could be found in the snow, and their contents would remain dry. The dimensions of the parfleche were standardized by life itself. They were ideal for pack horses. They were usually made in pairs to balance the load on either side of the animal. But in winter, when migration ceased, they were turned into stationary cupboards and storerooms. It was a modular storage system that was centuries ahead of its time. The durability of the rawhide was such that even the sharp claws of small animals could not bite through it on the first try. And the lack of smell made these containers invisible to the animal's nose. The Indians understood that preserving food was as difficult as obtaining it, and they spared no effort in creating high-quality packaging. The parfleche was a symbol of thrift and order, contrasting with the chaos of the wild. This technology proves that the Indians were not primitive gatherers, but inventive engineers of their daily lives. They used available materials with maximum efficiency, creating things that lasted for decades. Parfleche is a monument to rationality and design, born in the harsh conditions of the steppes. We have talked about food and its storage, but there is another aspect that everyone is silent about. What to do when there is food, but it needs to be stretched out for an unknown period of time? Are you ready for the shocking truth that the main action for survival was inaction? In our culture, it is customary to believe that in order to be saved, you need to act actively, run, fight, do something. But in the snowy captivity of the plains, any activity became an enemy that consumed precious calories. The Indians practiced a strategy of conscious immobility, turning themselves into something like hibernating bears. This was not laziness, but a strict discipline of conserving metabolic energy. When a storm began, life in the camp froze not only outside, but also inside. People tried to spend as much time as possible lying under warm bison skins, reducing heat loss from the body. Movements became slow and smooth, conversations quiet and rare, so as not to waste air. Every extra movement meant a gram of fat burned that might be needed later. It was the art of being a stone that retained heat. In this silence and stillness, food was perceived differently, not as a snack on the go, but as a rare injection of life. A small piece of pemmican or fat, eaten at rest, was absorbed as efficiently as possible. The body was not distracted by muscle work and directed all its resources to warming the internal organs. This made it possible to significantly reduce the diet without compromising health. Psychologically, it was incredibly difficult to endure days or even weeks in a confined space without movement. To keep from going mad from sensory deprivation, people immersed themselves in the world of oral stories and legends. The elders told legends in a quiet, monotonous voice that lulled and soothed. These stories replaced physical activity with the work of the imagination, allowing the mind to travel while the body remained in place. Sleep became the main ally of survivors, erasing time and reducing the feeling of hunger. The Indians knew how to fall into a state of semi-sleep when consciousness balances on the edge of sleep and wakefulness. In this state, metabolism slowed down, breathing became shallow, and the need for food decreased. It was a technique of deep meditation available to every member of the tribe. An important aspect was collective warmth. People slept huddled close together. Their bodies created a single thermal contour, which was easier to maintain than the temperature of an individual. It was always warmer in the center of this living pile, and people periodically changed places so that no one froze on the edge. This unity was the physical embodiment of tribal solidarity. The refusal to fight nature in favor of merging with its rhythm was a key philosophical concept. A storm is a time when the world stops, and man must stop with it. Trying to shout down the wind or overcome the cold would be a foolish waste of energy. The wisdom lay in becoming small, quiet, and invisible to death. Such tactics of passive survival require tremendous endurance and self-control. It is very difficult to force yourself to lie still when your instincts are screaming that you need to do something. But it was precisely the ability to suppress panic and force oneself to freeze that distinguished an experienced survivor from a novice. It was a victory of reason over animal instincts. The strategy of immobility, combined with high-calorie cold food, created an ideal balance of resources. Supplies lasted a long time because consumption was kept to a minimum. This is the equation of life and death, in which the Indians found the right solution. In the next chapter, you will learn how a simple piece of raw fat could become the most coveted delicacy. In the modern world, fat is often perceived as an enemy of health, something unnecessary that needs to be eliminated. But for the Plains Indians, pure white solid fat was a sacred substance that gave life. In the harshest moments of a blizzard, when even pemmican ran out or had to be conserved, the untouchable reserve came into play: raw fat and bone marrow. It was white energy in its purest form, a concentrate that did not even require chewing. Bison kidney fat, which was solid and almost odorless, was particularly valuable. It was cut into small cubes and eaten like candy, allowing it to melt slowly in the mouth. The feeling of enveloping warmth spreading through the esophagus was the best remedy for internal shivering. The fat began to warm up almost immediately, entering the bloodstream and triggering thermogenesis. Bone marrow was an even more valuable resource, a true delicacy of survival. Large tubular bison bones were split with heavy stones to get to the fatty, oily core. The brain was eaten raw, as any heat treatment would result in the loss of precious drops of fat. Its consistency was similar to butter, but it was much more nutritious and rich. The Indians knew that eating pure protein without fat in cold weather was a path to exhaustion. There is even a term, protein poisoning, when the body spends its own resources on processing meat. Therefore, fat was never discarded or trimmed. On the contrary, it was added wherever possible. A piece of fat was the best gift for a hungry person. In blizzard conditions, when water was scarce, fatty foods had another advantage. They did not cause intense thirst. Digesting carbohydrates and proteins requires more water than digesting fats. Thus, a fatty diet helped maintain the body's water balance, which was critically important when the only source of water was cold snow, which is dangerous to eat in large quantities. The taste of raw fat may seem repulsive to modern humans, but taste preferences are a matter of adaptation. For people living on the brink of freezing, this taste was the taste of safety and peace. The body itself demanded this kind of food, sending signals to the brain that it needed the most caloric fuel. It was a natural response to extreme stress. Fat reserves were stored in the stomachs or bladders of animals, creating airtight sausages. This packaging prevented the fat from going rancid and absorbing foreign odors. These sausages were a strategic currency that could be used to pay or trade in times of need. Losing a bag of fat was worse than losing a weapon. Sometimes the fat was mixed with a small amount of snow to create a kind of ice cream. This allowed them to cool their sore throats a little and get a boost of energy at the same time. But more often it was eaten warmed in the hands or under the armpit so as not to waste the body's internal heat on warming food in the stomach. This chapter in the history of nutrition reminds us how flexible the human body can be. We are able to switch to completely different sources of energy depending on the conditions. For Native Americans, fat was not a cause of obesity, but a guarantee that they would see the next sunrise. It was an extreme diet for extreme conditions. But what did the Indians do when the storm dragged on and the supplies in the teepee were running low? Even the most spacious parflimes in the teepee had their limits, and a prolonged siege by the weather could deplete household supplies. For this case, the Indians had developed a system of external storage facilities, hiding places hidden deep underground. These refrigerators were not just pits, but complex engineering structures designed to preserve provisions for many months, away from the eyes of enemies and the noses of predators. The hiding place was usually bell-shaped, narrow at the top, widening towards the bottom to form a spacious chamber. This shape ensured the strength of the arches and minimized the size of the entrance, which was easier to camouflage. The pits were dug in dry places, often on high ground, so that groundwater would not flood the supplies. The walls were carefully compacted and sometimes burned or lined with dry grass and skins for insulation. These underground chambers were used to store the most durable foods: bags of pemmican, dried meat, bundles of timsala, and even supplies of dried corn if the tribe traded with farmers. The food was laid out in layers, separated by grass or bark to ensure ventilation and prevent clumping. One such pit could store food for an entire family for several weeks. Camouflaging the cache was an art. The entrance was covered with a thick shield of branches and skins, then covered with earth, turf, and snow to restore the natural landscape. A fire could be lit on top to hide the fresh earth with ash, or a herd of horses could be driven over it to destroy any traces of excavation with their hooves. Only the owner knew the exact landmarks that could be used to find the cache in the white field. During a blizzard, if supplies in the teepee ran out, the men had to make a dangerous trip to the nearest hiding place. It was a real special operation. They had to find the place under the snow, dig out the entrance, get the food, and return without getting lost in the white fog. Caches were often made not far from the winter camp for such cases in order to minimize the risk. These underground storerooms were insurance against complete disaster. Even if enemies attacked the camp and burned the tipis, or if wild animals ravaged the above-ground supplies, the underground storerooms remained untouched. It was an untouchable reserve that gave hope for revival even after the most terrible losses. Interestingly, tribes often left such caches along their migration routes, creating a network of supply points throughout the territory. Returning to the same place a year later, they could take advantage of the supplies left behind. This required the highest level of trust within the community and respect for the supplies of others, as theft from a cache was considered a serious crime. The caching system helped smooth out the unpredictability of hunting. If the bison left or the hunt was unsuccessful, the tribe could live off the resources from the pits. This made them independent of momentary luck and the whims of nature. The caches were a bank into which they invested their labor in the summer to earn interest in the winter. The technology of building and camouflaging pits was passed down from generation to generation. It was not just digging the ground, but creating a life support system. Underground storerooms were the invisible foundation of the plains economy, hidden from prying eyes but as reliable as the earth itself. Thus, the Indians did not simply react to circumstances, but shaped their environment, creating reserves of strength. But there was another category of products that came from outside and was valued at its weight in gold. Although the Plains tribes were primarily hunters, their winter diet was not limited to meat and wild roots. An important part of their survival strategy was trade with sedentary agricultural peoples living in river valleys, such as the Mandan or Arikara. These peoples grew the famous Three Sisters: corn, squash, and beans. Dried vegetables became a precious addition to the nomads' table, adding variety and necessary carbohydrates. Dried squash was a unique product for the storm menu. It was cut into long spiral strips and dried to a crispy chip. In this form, it was light, compact, and sweet to the taste. In a blizzard, these pumpkin strips could be chewed dry, like a dried treat. They softened in the mouth, giving a feeling of volume and satiety that was different from the heaviness of meat. Corn, especially special hard varieties, also stored well. Its kernels were roasted or dried, turning them into a light and nutritious snack that could be carried in a pouch on a belt. Roasted corn was the prototype of modern popcorn, only harder and more filling. It could be chewed for hours, helping to stave off hunger and keep the jaws busy. Trade fairs held in the fall before the snowfall began were a critical stage in preparing for winter. Nomads exchanged skins, meat, and horses for sacks of grain and dried vegetables. This exchange was mutually beneficial. Farmers received protein and materials for clothing, while hunters received carbohydrates and vitamins. No one wanted to go into winter with only one type of resource. Having corn or pumpkin in the pantry was considered a sign of prosperity and good family preparation. These were luxury foods that were saved for special occasions or for the hardest days when the body needed something other than fat. The variety of flavors helped maintain morale, reminding people that the world was not just cold and bison. Sometimes, if they managed to melt a little snow, they made a thick porridge from corn flour and fat, which did not require long cooking. But even in dry form, these products were easily digestible. Beans usually required cooking, so they were used less often in emergency situations without fire, with preference given to ready-to-eat pumpkin and corn. Trade links permeated the entire continent, creating a web of security. A tribe suffering from famine could count on the help of its trading partners. This social dimension of survival was no less important than the physical one. Loneliness in the steppe meant death, while ties with neighbors offered a chance. The culture of exchange taught diplomacy and planning. Chiefs had to anticipate the tribe's needs 6 months in advance and ensure that there were enough goods to exchange. It was a sophisticated economy for the Stone Age, where calories and labor served as currency. These plant supplements made the diet more balanced, although the Indians did not know the scientific terms. They simply saw that those who ate vegetables were stronger and more resilient. An instinctive desire for diversity saved them from disease and exhaustion. Thus, by combining hunting with the gifts of agriculture, the peoples of the plains created an ideal food system. But every storm ends sooner or later, and the moment of truth arrives. When the wind finally died down and the tipi canvas stopped flapping, a ringing silence ensued. It was the moment when people could go outside for the first time in several days and assess the aftermath of the storm. The world had changed beyond recognition. Familiar landmarks disappeared under snowdrifts, and the landscape became a blank slate. The first thing to do was to dig out the exits and check on the neighbors to make sure everyone had survived the blockade. Those who had followed the right strategy, eating fatty cold food, staying still, and keeping calm, and emerged from their homes, perhaps a little thinner, but full of energy. Their eyes were clear and their movements confident. They were not exhausted by the struggle against the cold because they did not fight it, but coexisted with it. Their bodies, running on internal fuel, successfully coped with the task. On the contrary, those who did not have sufficient supplies or panicked, trying to keep warm through activity without proper nutrition, found themselves in a deplorable state. The storm was a cruel judge who passed sentence without the right of appeal. But in the Plains community, mutual aid was the law. The more fortunate families shared the remains of their supplies with those who had suffered more. The survival of the tribe depended on everyone, and the loss of even one person was a tragedy. After the storm, life began in earnest. The men checked on the horses, which also knew how to find grass under the snow, while the women inspected the supplies and prepared the first hot meal in many days. The smoke from the fires rising into the clear, frosty sky was a symbol of life's victory over death. That first hot broth seemed like the most delicious meal in the world after days of dry rations. The experience of each blizzard was carefully analyzed. The elders and experienced hunters discussed whose supplies had been preserved better, which pemmican was more filling, and how the parfleche had behaved. This knowledge was added to the tribe's collective wisdom. Mistakes were taken into account so as not to repeat them the following winter. It was a continuous process of learning and improving survival techniques. Nature itself provided new opportunities after the storm. Deep snow made it difficult for bison to move, making them easier prey for hunters on snowshoes. Often, immediately after a storm, it was possible to replenish supplies of fresh meat, compensating for what had been eaten during the days of confinement. The cycle of life resumed. The story of the Indians' survival in the blizzard is not a story of miraculous rescue, but a story of professionalism and preparation. They did not wait for mercy from nature, but prepared for its worst manifestations. Their anti-storm rations were not just food, but a tool, a technology that allowed a person to remain human in inhuman conditions. We see that the absence of fire did not mean the end of the world. It simply changed the rules of the game, for which the Indians were prepared. Their ability to adapt, use fat as fuel, and remain calm in the dark deserves admiration and respect. These lessons from the past are still relevant today. They remind us of the importance of preparation, the value of simple things, and the power of the human spirit, which is capable of finding warmth even where it seems to be absent. We have journeyed from the howling darkness of an icy storm to the blinding sun of a frosty morning, learning the secrets of those who called these harsh lands home. Pemmican, Vasna, raw fat, and caches are not just ethnographic details. They are links in a chain that held life together on the edge of the abyss. The Indians proved that survival is not so much a struggle as it is knowledge and harmony with the surrounding world, even when it turns its cruelest side toward you. Do you think modern people, accustomed to comfort, could survive in such conditions with the same knowledge and supplies? Or has our dependence on technology made us too vulnerable? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new dives into the history of survival.